for everyone who's able to be here live, it's been nice to meet you. And for anyone who has to watch later, we hope this can be a helpful session. For those of you who know Gina, she kind of approached us about doing a question and response regarding running. We are 4 physical therapists here at Point Forward Physical Therapy. We have been in Stevens Point for what, 13 years. And just recently got our own location. We're on Hoover Road now in the old Bacher Water building. One of the things that our clinic has kind of moved towards over the last 12 years is being a movement and running specialty clinic. All of us have attended continued coursework out in Los Angeles at the Movement Performance Institute. That's a place where we learned under Chris Powers, who's a biomechanist, and we learned how to apply the movement and biomechanics and breaking down running into very small segments into running and how that can contribute to overload and running related injuries. So we're excited to be able to share that in a lot of different ways. One of them, if people have been seeing our Facebook, we've been trying to do some video series. I'm, unfortunately for you all, I'm the face of those videos, but I'm just transferring knowledge that we all have here at the clinic and that we all apply with the people that we see on a regular basis. So just a quick intro of the therapists here. I'll try to, we'll see how we do with Zoom, but starting over here, let's see, can I point to his head right here? There's Damon. Damon Kazicki, he's been with us for how many years now?
13 years.
13 years since its inception. Been a therapist for over 25 years. So he's been doing this a long time and a brilliant mind. Next here is Ryan Flugar. He has been around for over 6 years. And in addition to running, he also does some stuff with golf as well. That's kind of a little niche area of his. And then, what's your name again? That's John. John's the owner and founder of Point Forward. But it's a fun crew over here. It's fun to work with these guys. And again, we all have been through a lot of the same training in addition to our normal education that we went through to become licensed physical therapists. So those are a couple of things just about us in general. The topic of today that we were going to start with is discussing ways to wisely start running, kind of how do people start to run and how should you do that wisely, and any questions people have on that, as well as running related injuries and how they pertain to training errors. So things that you do as you try to get started running or start to become a faster or longer runner, in ways that the way that you train could lead to injuries. So we're going to kind of run through some of that stuff today. All of this has kind of been laid out in some fashion in the videos, but I'm sure there are people who haven't been able to see all of those videos as well. So any question is fair game as it relates to running. One more thing before we jump in, some things that we do here at the clinic in terms of services for runners. We have a running club that meets, well, not right now in the midst of COVID, but we're talking about what it looks like to restart. But we do have a running club that we try to give people free access to our knowledge to some extent on those mornings. So if something starts to creep up, you can come to those running clubs and one of our therapists will be there so that you can ask them questions and maybe get a couple tips just because we want to help out runners. And it's been a fun place. We've had a lot of people coming and it's been growing, and it's been fun to hear people's testimonies of their experience running and how the run club has been an encouragement for them. I know Gina is also spearheading the Spark Run Club, the Stevens Point Area Run Club, which has been a huge success too and runs at different times. So whatever works for people's schedule, it's just nice to get a community. And then we also do, in addition to regular physical therapy appointments, we do detailed running analysis, which we'll probably go into throughout this Q&A. And we have programs for people who are just starting to run, like Couch to 5K programs. So if people have questions about those, feel free to ask those as well. So at this point though, we're gonna kind of open it up to you guys for any questions you might have pertaining to running. Again, there really isn't limitations, but pertaining to running, tips on how to get started, or training errors. or if you have any questions about our clinic. So I'm gonna back up, and then as one of us has answers, we're probably just gonna have to walk forward and back just so that the audio comes through okay.
All right. Anybody have any questions, or do you want to? We can just start talking as well.
Gina's putting in a question. Wise use of the chat. That's a good idea. So if you have questions, you can submit them on the chat. We'll be able to read them and answer them. That'll be the easiest way to do it. So let's answer this question first. The question that Gina put, which you can see it in the chat, is what is the most common running mistake you see in new runners?
I'll just step up and take this one-ish. Yeah. Okay, so probably the most common mistake, there's two mistakes that I would go with. One is training errors. Training errors lead to almost every injury that you see. I mean, it's overdoing, underdoing, bad surface, bad shoes, bad form. And then the second one I would say is really it's about the mechanics. And so you see somebody with poor mechanics, and one of the things that we really try to push, is most people will run to get fit, and we really need to get fit to run. We get a little ahead of ourselves with that, and so what will happen is in the process of trying to actually train ourselves to run, things fall apart, and then the whole program can fall apart. So I don't know if you guys had anything, but that would be my answer on the most common mistake we see. As far as most common injury with runners, statistically, it's the knee. You tend to see the patellofemoral joint. And I believe it's 60 to 70% of injuries that runners experience aren't patellofemoral or knee pain. And then I forget the breakdown after that if it's ankle or hip, which comes next. But definitely the knee tends to be what takes the load and is the most common injury.
I think in terms of common mistakes, it's along the same vein that John was talking, but I think a lot of times people get a little overzealous early on. So they'll start with goals that maybe overshoot the wise way to step into activities. And I think it's because we don't realize, because running has become such a popular form of exercise, I think a lot of times we don't think of how impactful it is on our joints. And it's a very high impact activity that's very repetitive too. So I've had a number of runners or just friends who are runners who decide or who want to start running, and they start with trying to do something like a run streak. And we had somebody reach out to us on our Facebook about our thoughts on running streaks. And I think that's a relatively common error, is if you're not running and then you're like, you know what, I'm going to try to run a mile every day for a month. Going from no running to a mile every day is a huge change in the amount of load that your muscles have to take. And so when it comes, I think that's in the vein of training errors. You're just taking your volume and you're taking it from 0 to 30 in a month, or a mile every day, or whatever it is. But people just go too far too fast. It's another one.
Yes. Let's take that one.
So the next question is the best way to reduce that injury, meaning, I believe, patellofemoral pain. First and foremost, I think adjusting your training schedule to reduce inflammation and treating inflammation with ice or anti-inflammatories to get the acute portion of the injury under control. But in the long run, which is really what we're trying to address when we work with people here, the patellofemoral joint, the compression of the patellofemoral joint is significantly affected by running form and quad dominance in particular. So when we depend on our quadricep excessively to do most of the control with running, then the compression through the knee and the patellofemoral joint becomes significant, more significant than our cartilage can endure with the number of repetitions that we are that we're basically doing with running. So we need to strengthen and involve other muscles that will reduce some of the compression through the knee joint. And namely, we look at the gluteal muscles and the calf as significant contributors. So in a nutshell, I would say adjusting your running schedule, treating the acute symptoms, and working on lower extremity strengthening, particularly the gluteals and calf muscles.
Do you want to take the turning to run after raise?
All right, so one of the other questions up there is, what are important considerations for returning to running after hiatus, not running related? So obviously one consideration is going to start with how long that hiatus is, but there's kind of a, let's say you've been a regular runner, it's been a regular part of your rhythm, whatever that volume is, and then you take a break and you come back. One of the things that's going to happen that we know from exercise physiology and the research related to that is that cardiovascular fitness decreases by, if you stop doing everything, if you go and you're doing your regular activities, then you stop everything for 2 weeks, you decrease your cardiovascular fitness by 50%. It doesn't take the same amount of time that it first took to build that, but your cardiovascular fitness is going to be significantly lower if you're taking even just 2 weeks off of a regular activity. Since we don't stop everything and just lay in our bed, hopefully, unless you had like an unfortunate event like surgery, but you won't lose that full 50%, but that is one factor that's going to have to be recuperated. So if you try to jump right back into your normal amount of running after a break, you will notice the difficulty breathing, you're going to notice the cardiovascular effect, and that also is going to impact your form when you run. As we get tired with our cardiovascular system, we're going to run with a different way of efficiency, because we do try to change even posturally how we can get air into our lungs. And if we're more tired, we're not going to be able to get appropriate blood flow to the muscles, which is going to fatigue them more quickly as well. So what that ultimately says is, depending on how long the hiatus was, depending on what you've been doing in between those times, whether you're doing some other type of activity or strengthening or not, you're probably going to have to decrease your volume and slowly build yourself back. Because one, again, your cardiovascular system isn't there. Two, your muscular system probably doesn't have the endurance that it used to for running. And three, the load tolerance of the surfaces in your joints, like the cartilage, might not be there yet. And this is not addressing Gina's question, but she was asking about the Jeff Galloway method, which actually I don't think any of us know a lot about that. You know about that? Okay, John can talk about that one a little bit. But even just the idea of starting off and returning with run walks, something to slowly integrate the loading impact and the demand on your cardiovascular system, could be something beneficial as you start to return after a break.
So the run walk method, I have a little experience with that. I've only seen used a couple of times. I would say if it gets you out there, it's effective, is kind of the approach that I took with it. I did have somebody that utilized it to get through an Ironman, the running portion, obviously, of the Ironman. And it was relatively successful. It's something that, I mean, if you're looking to win the Ironman, it's a good way to get into it. It's probably not an advanced training technique that I would recommend. As far as it being better or worse for your joints, it's interesting. If you think of your typical person that you know, for example, that's had a total knee replacement, they aren't, you don't typically picture somebody that's a real thin, light physique that looks like they've been active. And what the studies show is that your greater risk for the joints wearing down and having arthritis and eventually resulting in total joint replacement is actually inactivity, not the activity. So as far as this being better or worse, I would say it's probably neither. It's probably a great way to get yourself out there and get into the race and at least start running and get into the whole spirit of it as you're moving into the race season or just racing in general or running. So.
Yeah, that one, you know, that one. I can speak to. We're going to talk about marathons per Shelley's request. What did she say? She said, what's a realistic timeline to run a marathon and prepare for a marathon, I'm assuming she means, right? Cool. There's no golden answer for this one. And I think the reality is it's an extremely vast array of people. Whereas if you're going from never running before to trying to get into running by running a marathon, again, I think that's where potential training error would come in, where you're overloading a tissue before it's ready. If you look at typical training plans that are put out by running coaches, and I think this is maybe another point to the side of this, there's a lot of different disciplines that can work together to help people run well and run healthy. I think one of those is obviously like a physical therapist who can break down biomechanics and assess injury risk, and then if little nagging injuries come, they can help rehab those. But also having a running coach who knows a lot about the different training methods and how to address tempo and pace and what type of methods are going to be appropriate for that, because they'll get their background a little bit more in exercise physiology too, which is beneficial. Anyway, back to the question about how long. The plans that are out there put out, like if you just search marathon training plan, some range up to 20 weeks for a training plan. So you're looking at 4 or 5 months of training. Some go down to even 12 weeks. I would say that if you're somebody who's not running a base mileage at all, like if you're going from nothing to running a marathon, I would extend even beyond the 5-month mark, just because to increase your mileage that much to be able to handle 26.2 miles at one stretch, that would probably be a lot for your joints. Again, it's not like they study this and they say, hey, these 20 people who've never ran are gonna do a marathon in 3 months and these 30 people are gonna do a marathon in 4 months. It's not that simple. But if you don't have a base of mileage, you're going to have to spread out the time probably beyond 4 to 5 months to safely do this. For those who have a base mileage, you know, if you're already running 30 miles a week on a regular basis, that you could shorten your time to be able to complete a marathon. And then the question is, how fast do you want to complete it? And then how does that impact how long your training comes? So I think, Shelley, there are a lot of questions within your question that we can't get into super deeply here, but I'd say for somebody who's new, you're looking at least a half a year to do it with some wisdom there. Great.
So to address, we have a question on the walking with breaking it up with some running. It depends what your goals are, would be my biggest thing. You want to make sure if that's your goal and that's what you want to do, I think breaking it up and throwing some intermittent runs in there is great. One of the things that I do with a lot of our people, and you can even incorporate into a running program, would be like a Tabata style, where you would run for a period of 20 to 30 seconds, rest for 10. A traditional Tabata would be 100% effort through that time frame, but it's probably something that, especially for a beginner, I would recommend you wouldn't go 100% right off the bat. It would be a nice thing to just, okay, let's run for 20 and let's take a break for 10 and start to cycle and then build those times so you get to more of a steady state where you could maybe run for a mile or two at a lighter pace. If you're looking at it, strictly from a cardiovascular standpoint, I personally would recommend throwing in the run intervals, but you do have to be careful of injury with that as well, and make sure that you've got everything addressed and all your pieces are there. Otherwise, like I had mentioned earlier, you start to take off on this program and all the pieces aren't there, and then the program falls apart, and then your whole fitness program and your idea and your goals all get shattered, and that's where things tend to really spiral backwards. So yeah, that's what I would respond to that one.
There's a chat. For Gina's question on good resources for nutrition and running, there's probably a lot to be said about that we don't know, but I am reading a book right now, which is called Advanced Marathoning, and there is a chapter in that book that does address nutrition. So Advanced Marathoning is one book that you could look up. But that's about all I got for that one right now. Sorry, Gina. There's some other common mistakes that
You want to talk about, then you want to talk about forefoot versus rear foot, strike, switching back and forth. You have to take that one on.
the lights.
All right. So, is that okay?
Yeah.
In the absence of questions, I'm just gonna, here we go. How important are shoes? I'm gonna talk for a second, then I'm gonna let the other guys take that, because we've got a couple guys that are far more adept at what's going on in the shoe world than I am. Shoes can be very important, for certain. They can make or break your ability to run and even injure you if you're not careful. It was interesting. I had a discussion with one of my kids this morning. One of the favorite things I like to cite is that there was a study done several years ago that showed that the more you spend on a pair of shoes, the more likely it is to injure you. And that's one of the things that it applies especially to the newer shoes as they come out. They aren't always thoroughly researched. But with that, I'm going to step aside and let either Damon or Nate, either one of them, take that question a little further.
Shoes are very important to running. I think the foundation of, as you run, your first impact with the ground is, of course, with your feet. And so foot structure is going to be a large determinant of which shoe you choose, and whether you choose a neutral shoe or a shoe that primarily is involved in shock absorption or motion control. And so you want to know your foot type primarily before you, in order to maybe start or determine your first pair of shoes that you might use to begin a running program. There are some good resources for we of course can help you determining foot type and what might be a good shoe type to begin with. But some stores locally also are relatively good at helping to determine foot type. I'm not entirely certain what the status of shoe stores is right now, as far as I guess they're not open. But specific foot types require shoe considerations. One of the other major concerns with regard to shoes is replacing them frequently enough. Shoes today are fairly well made, and they can look good on the top, and you can you can have a shoe for a year's time, and if you took good care of it, it might look like it doesn't need to be replaced. However, if you look at your mechanics, when you run, if you would video your foot mechanics when you bought the shoe versus 500 miles later or 1,000 miles later, they will be significantly different. And if your foot isn't functioning properly, it does and can affect how your knee functions and on up the chain. And so another consideration is if you apply too much control to your foot, then that can lead to injuries as well. So you want to have enough control. You don't want to have too much. And sometimes there's a bit of, that's not so black and white, because there are a lot of considerations up the chain as far as how well you absorb shock when you run, whether you're a quad dominant runner or your strength. And so sometimes shoe wear will evolve. The type of shoes you wear will evolve over time based on specific movement patterns up the chain. So I guess those are my initial thoughts on shoe wear. I don't know if that somewhat addresses your question, Shelley.
I'll give one other shoe thought, kind of just my scoping philosophy on it. In terms of a lot of the marketing that's put into by the running shoe industry is to show you how this shoe is going to make you a faster runner or a better runner. And I think I land more in the camp that a shoe isn't going to make the runner, but the shoe could pose a problem or break the runner. And so don't caution against letting the marketing of a shoe that tells you it's either going to reduce your injury risk or it's going to make you a faster or better runner. I'd be cautious with those. There are a couple shoes that have come out in the last year that have claimed injury reduction. They just don't release the studies on that. They say it happens. They say they did the studies, but they don't release them to the public. So we don't actually know what those studies are. And knowing the variability between people, as Damon was talking about, with foot type and the amount of motion that your foot is going through as you run, just be cautious with anything that says this shoe is going to reduce injury for everybody. It's typically not that simple. So, and then at the same time, a shoe probably won't be good enough to make you the fastest marathoner or help you beat Tim Thornburg or something. So, the other piece about shoes, and I'll tie this maybe into the question that just popped up, if I'm just starting out, can I use my walking shoes? And I think it depends on, obviously it depends on what you have for your walking shoes. But Damon was talking about the durability of shoes and replacing them appropriately. And a piece of that is determined by the type of foam that's used in what's called the midsole of the shoe. So like you said, the upper part of it, like whatever material they use up there might look great. And even the rubber on the outside might look great, but the foam in the middle might get compressed really quickly over time. So you've probably seen shoes at the store that cost as little as $10, and then you've seen shoes that cost upwards of, $275 for a pair of marathon racing shoes. So you have this huge scope of cost. Part of the cost does have to do with what that foam is made out of. So if you have the structure within those foams is different. And so if you have a shoe that costs $100 or $120, they're likely putting a higher quality foam that is going to resist flattening more readily. So it won't get compressed as quickly. Whereas if you buy a cheaper shoe that typically has a less quality foam, which is going to compress earlier, and then whatever needs you had from that shoe for providing stability, they would dissipate more quickly. So a cheaper shoe typically is going to need to be replaced sooner, whereas something that's a little bit more expensive may last longer. And now in the running shoe industry, most shoes are made with what's called EVA, which is a little bit temperature resistant. So like as you run, your feet heat up, and that heat can change the structure of the foam and cause it to compress more easily. But the EVA foams that are used are relatively resistant to that. And then there's even newer foams that are out called PBA and PBAX foams, that some of that has some good temperature resistance as well. They typically don't list those on what the shoe is made out of when you're at the store, but I think the overarching thing with the can I use my walking shoes, it's I think maybe if they have a foam that's not going to deform too quickly and that don't already have so many miles on them where they've compressed. That's what I got there.
So I want to address the question about running versus walking. The benefits of running, it's really goal dependent and where you want to be. One of the things that I would argue on the running is that you're going to see a greater cardiovascular benefit. And when you look at running versus walking, the way we define a true run is that it's essentially a hop from one leg to another leg, and that there is never a period of time where both feet are on the ground, pardon me. So it tends to be more strenuous. So you're going to get, it's the equivalent of hopping on a leg over and over and over. And so as opposed to walking where there's double limb support, where both feet are on the ground and you're progressing forward. So it is more strenuous. And it's just really what your goals are. If you're looking to lose weight or burn more calories or improve your cardiovascular system more rapidly, certainly running is going to do that. If you prefer walking, running's painful, you're just uncomfortable doing it, that's perfectly fine. There's no reason not to walk for the cardiovascular benefits. It's going to be a little bit more vigorous with the running. So somebody want to talk about forefoot versus rear foot strike?
Sure. A little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have a lot of questions about whether or not what's the preferable way to run, whether you should use a forefoot striking pattern, a midfoot, or a rear foot striking pattern. And I think there is a lot of discussion and disagreement around this issue. Each form of running has different requirements, and each can require a different type of shoe. But if you're looking at forefoot striking, you're primarily looking at landing on the ball of your foot, using your calf muscle to a great degree to initiate your first form of shock absorption, and then requiring your knee and hip thereon to help you with shock absorption. The claim or the argument that forefoot strike is better than a rear foot strike is that perhaps there's not as much shock or as much force when you first strike the ground when running versus a heel striker. However, the argument for heel strike, I think, is that beyond that initial contact, there is better ability for your body to be able to set you up to absorb shock and then move into your next phase of running, which will propel you onto your next step. Those are my initial thoughts on that. You guys?
I think the other thing to think about is if you are a rear foot striker and you're going to switch to a forefoot strike, you're basically starting over. So I have a couple of people that were running like 30 miles a week on a rear foot strike, and then they switch to a forefoot and they go out and run their 30 miles a week. They're almost going to get hurt just because like what Damon said, your stress on your muscles, your cardiovascular system may be ready to handle that, but your muscles are definitely not. It's using a different set of muscles to do it. So I think it's really important to realize that that's a very different type of running, and you almost have to restart your training to train those muscles in that way that you're gonna run. So I think that's another consideration if you're gonna do something like that.
One thing I would like to kind of point out with all that, when we talk about forefoot versus rear foot, and it's a really common question, and it's a big question that's been out there for a while, and some of the biggest minds, at least on the research side of running, that are out there actually differ on it as far as what's better. Irene Davis, who's out of Harvard, is a big proponent of the forefoot running, as opposed to Chris Powers out in LA with USC, who tends to fall more towards a heel strike. And then I would argue of the kind of the middle ground would be Brian Heiderscheit, who argues more towards cadence manipulation as the best way to run, meaning you bump your cadence up to minimize the load coming through the joints. And I've had the privilege of hearing them all three speak in the same room a couple times. And what's really interesting is if you go back a few years, they were all very hard-headed that, their way was the best way. And over the years, they've all kind of come to my way is the best way, but we need to address the mechanics first. And so Powers won't tell you not to run on your forefoot, but he also won't change it. Where other thought is, well, we need to get you off your heel. Generally, my approach in the clinic is if I have somebody that comes in on their is a forefoot runner or a midfoot striker, I leave them there and I correct their mechanics. And I think that that's been the most successful thing. I don't find that actually flipping someone onto their forefoot has been beneficial. And as a matter of fact, I think all of us intermittently have seen injuries that have resulted from somebody that's tried to transition one way or the other, and it has gone kind of south for them. So, yeah.
I'll add one last thought on the rear foot strike, mid to forefoot strike. The other piece that is impacted is running efficiency. So there was a study done on cardiovascular effort. That's as people switched from a rear foot to a forefoot, and people became quote unquote worse runners. They expended more energy running the same pace when they switched. And so you're not only changing the mechanical load that could predispose you to injury, but you are less efficient as you switch. Long term, I haven't read studies on long-term effects, but at least in the short term, if you do decide that switching is what you need to do for whatever reason, that there is an impact that you're going to become less efficient at least for a while. But like everybody's kind of said, if you get a running related injury, the first step in helping with that injury is probably not to switch your forefoot to a forefoot or from a forefoot to a rear foot strike. That's usually not the first step. That's a huge change that impacts every single part of the gait cycle and the running cycle. So you could have a lot of other things pop up. There's a lot of other correctable things within your chosen foot strike pattern that could be addressed before you try to make a huge change, like switching from rear to forefoot or vice versa. There's 2 questions on there we can talk about.
So let me take Shelly's question on the weightlifting. So how important is weightlifting in preventing an injury? It can be very important, or it can be the cause of the injury, and it's all about the form of the lift. It's all about what you're training. Damon had mentioned earlier, running with a very quad dominant posture, and that's something that we see very regularly, and we see a lot of people really training those quads, trying to get these great quads for their race. Like Damon had said earlier, you really set yourself up to increase the pressure back behind the kneecap when you're running. That quad is just going to pull so hard to hold the body up, as opposed to it being a balanced force through the whole lower extremity. So if it's done properly, it can be immensely beneficial. There's, you know, to find out what you are specifically needing, you really need to see somebody that can test that, whether it's a therapist or I guess being a therapist, I'm going to say a therapist, but you know, you need to address your issues of weakness, you know, and the most common certainly are calf, hip, hamstring, and very rarely quads. Kind of in that order tends to be what I find on the weakness front. The biggest thing that most people lack, especially distance runners, is you see a lot of hip weakness. And that's something that we spend a lot of time addressing with our runners. And the one key I feel to a lot of that is that, number one, you have to be able to reliably contract the hip and strengthen it, which is a big deal, because a lot of times we use the technology that we have here in the clinic. We use a surface EMG, which actually shows the nerves firing into the hip. You can see the electrical changes going on around those hip muscles. And we can have people do squats. We can have them walk around the room, and they've learned so successfully to use the quad, the hamstring, and everything else that you don't even see the hip turning on. So getting a hold of a good hip program that actually targets the hip is key. A lot of traditional exercises like a squat. I've had several of my patients, matter of fact, it happened just earlier this week, come in and they can do a full squat without turning on the glute at all, which is a traditional hip strengthening exercise. So you really do need to talk to somebody about how to do it correctly, making sure your form is right, and more importantly, making sure that you're actually getting that muscle firing. So yeah, somebody want to take on wear of a running shoe?
One last thing on weightlifting. One other thing that can be helpful when you're going out for running with weightlifting injury prevention is to, before you go out for a run, is to prime your muscular system to get ready to run. So John was talking about specific exercises for your hip. And what I like to do when I go out for a run, and what I think can be beneficial, is basically doing what are called activation exercises, which we won't go into it all now, way too much. Long story short, there you could do some hip activation exercises, which would be like isometric holds. You could look these up if you want, but like a clamshell or a hip abduction exercise, and do a couple hold type exercises, and then go do some toe walks and heel walks, which would start to prime and activate some of the muscles in your calf. So basically getting the muscles that we're going to use during running ready right before you run could be helpful.
The next question is, when does a running shoe wear out? Generally, you can look at that in several different ways. A good basic recommendation is that they should be replaced every 400 to 500 miles. However, sometimes they wear out much earlier than that. Some of that can depend on the shoe type, the EVA, which is the midsole, the weight of the person, how hard they're pounding when they run, what type of surface they're running on. So you can't just strictly look at mileage as the only determinant of when you're going to replace your shoe. Although I think a mileage log is important to keep in that respect. If you would set a pair of shoes down on a table and look at it from the backside, if the shoe is either leaning to the out or to the in without any weight, without somebody standing in them, they're just on the table and you're looking at them from behind and they're leaning either in or out to any significant degree, more than a few degrees, I would say, they're probably worn out in the midsole. If they are not controlling pronation, if when you run, you're not controlling foot movement, excessive foot movement well enough, that shoe is worn out as well. I think with respect to the upper part of the shoe, if the material has started to stretch enough to allow slippage within the shoe and you're having a lot of shear, a lot of movement of your forefoot, likely that's a good indication that shoe wear should be replaced as well. If you pull the sock liner out of a shoe and you're seeing that the sock liner is wearing through to the foam underneath the top material because of the amount of shear, it's very likely that shoe is near the end of its life as well. Do you guys have any other thoughts on?
Do you look at creasing in the EVA then?
Creasing in the EVA, that's a good indication. When I was talking about what I was talking about earlier, if the shoe leans either to the in or to the out, the reason a shoe would lean one way or the other is because the EVA is no longer resilient or doesn't rebound from impact. And so if you look at the EVA, especially on the lateral or outer portion of the shoe back by the heel, over time you'll see that there are creases in the EVA that are permanently there. They don't occur just upon compression, but they stay there even after compression. And so if there's a lot of creasing in your EVA in the midsole, it's likely an indication that the EVA is nearing the end of its lifespan or its ability to rebound after impact.
Okay, I'll jump on the shin splints and I'll let everybody else jump in here in a minute too. So shin splints, I'll not speak for everybody else. I kind of view that as it's kind of a broad-based category, and some people would even, I have even used, that's kind of a garbage can term because it can mean quite a bit. Anything from a stress fracture of the tibia to some irritation of the muscle and tendons around the front side of the shin. So it generally though, when you start to see shin splints come on, you've got a shock absorption problem somewhere in the chain, and that's what needs to be addressed. And then you have to look at why is that? Is it that their form is bad? Okay. Is it that they don't have the strength to control their form? Is it just a habit? Are they just a real stiff runner and then all that shock is actually accumulating in the shin area? Or is it that they're very weak? I've seen that as well, where the muscles on the front side of the shin are extremely weak and they can't control their foot coming down. And so that muscle gets strained every time they try to control the foot and keep it from slapping into the ground as they come forward. So, as far as recommendations, it's really case dependent, and it's really, shin splints is kind of such a broad category that to say, I'd recommend one thing wouldn't be accurate. It's interesting, Gina, I saw that you posted that you can tell when your shoes wear out because you start to get those shin splints. And again, I would argue in that situation, you're probably relying on the shoe for some of your shock absorption. And when that shock absorption disappears, suddenly you start to accumulate that in your calf, or pardon me, in your shin. Stretching before you
Sure. We only got a couple minutes left. John threw out a question, so I'm going to respond to it. He was asking kind of the idea of what is the importance or lack of importance, or where does the importance fall when it comes to stretching before an activity. I talked a little bit about before running. I talked a little bit about kind of doing some muscle activation exercises, so a little bit of strengthening right before you run. And you guys can speak into this as well, or if you agree or disagree. But there is research out that's looked at the effect of traditional static stretching before running, and it's actually been shown to be. It hasn't been shown to increase injury risk, but it has not been beneficial as it used to be thought of. So the idea of holding either a hamstring stretch or a quad stretch for 30 seconds to a minute before you run is not the wisest way to start your run. Typically, you want to be doing more of a dynamic warm-up, which would include muscle activation exercises or stretches that move you through something without a static hold. Part of the idea of that is if your muscles are what we would call cold before you start an activity, which just part of that means that there's not a lot of blood flow to that area. And if there's not a lot of blood flow and there's not a lot of fluid moving through, the elasticity of the muscles is lower. So if you're trying to stretch a muscle that's cold or not warmed up, that can sometimes lead to a little bit of straining through that muscle. And so it's not leading to beneficial use during the activity. Whereas if you're doing a warm-up that includes a dynamic sort of use of the muscle with a little bit of lengthening for short periods of time, that can kind of just warm up the muscle versus trying to create a static stretch through it. Any other thoughts?
Right, so in the 2 minutes we have left, I'm going to throw out kind of a shameless plug on this whole thing. One of the things that you've heard myself and some of the others refer to frequently is the importance of the mechanics. And one of the things that is relatively rare in the world of running is someone who actually specializes in the mechanics or has training. There's lots of people out there that have lots of anecdotal work, or they this works for my runners or that works. And one of the things that our clinic has really focused on is taking that subjectivity out. So we not only use high-speed cameras to make sure that we've got the proper running form, breaking it down to less than 100th of a second. We also utilize that surface EMG to make sure that we're actually getting the activation of the muscles that we want. And it's for us, it's very crucial. And it's actually, it can be a real life-changing experience when we take someone who's had such a terrible time running and you start to work on what really matters. And I would encourage anybody that's thinking about, like getting serious about their running and really wants to take a good look at what they're doing, to have a therapist take a look, a trained therapist take a look at those mechanics. And that's a very specific skill set, and you're going to want to research your therapist and make sure you've got that. So with that, I think unless somebody else has any more questions or if you guys has anything else they want to throw in, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Okay.
Thank you guys. This was really helpful. Thank you so much for the presentation, and I did record it all, and I'm hoping Gina may and Ignite may put it up on their Facebook pages or something like that.